Every empire thinks its taxes are reasonable. Kings never say, "We're squeezing you because we mismanage the state." They talk about modernization, efficiency, and reform. They insist the burden is shared, the pain is necessary, the future will be better. On paper, in the capital, in the language of ministers and accountants, it all sounds rational. But in the villages of New Granada, in the Andean highlands of Peru, in the streets and markets of Mexico City in the late 1700s, people saw something very different. They saw their tobacco, their liquor, their cloth, their harvests suddenly measured, stamped, and taxed to keep a distant empire afloat. They watched strangers from Europe step into offices their families had held for generations. They saw old informal deals vanish and new rigid rules descend from above. And they began to ask a dangerous question. If this is reform, why does it feel like punishment? That question sits at the heart of the Bourbon reforms, the sweeping program launched by Spain's new Bourbon dynasty in the 18th century. On the surface, these reforms were about saving a decaying empire. In practice, they helped tax that empire toward revolution. Welcome back to the Ledger, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how a package of fiscal and administrative reforms helped blow apart one of the largest empires in history, you have to start with Spain's problem. By the early 1700s, Spain is a great power on paper and a fiscal wreck in reality. The old Habsburg line has stumbled through bankruptcies, military defeats, and corruption. The empire is huge, stretching from California to Patagonia, but the royal treasury is often empty. Silver from the Americas leaks out through smuggling, bribery, and foreign creditors. Colonial elites keep a large share of wealth in their own hands. Local authorities treat royal regulations as suggestions. Then, after the War of the Spanish Succession, a new dynasty takes the throne. The Bourbons, imported from France. They bring with them a different mentality, shaped by the centralized French state. Intendants, professional administrators, rationalized taxes, carefully regulated monopolies, a mercantilist belief that the purpose of colonies is to enrich the metropole as efficiently as possible. Looking at the Americas, the Bourbons see not communities, but inefficiencies. Too many exemptions, too much local autonomy, too much room for Creole elites to operate as small kings under a distant big king. So they set out to fix it. Their diagnosis is simple. The colonies are undertaxed, undercontrolled, and underdisciplined. The solution is a wave of reforms that will stretch over decades. They redraw the map of the empire, carving it into new units. They create new viceroyalties like New Granada and Rio de la Plata, areas carved out of old jurisdictions, in part to keep any single colonial capital from becoming too powerful. They introduce intendancies, administrative districts run by appointed officials with broad powers over taxes and justice. They expel the Jesuits in 1767, seizing their wealth and schools, both to assert royal authority and to remove a powerful semi-independent order that often defended local interests. They open some ports to legal trade, aiming to reduce smuggling by allowing more controlled commerce with Spain. And most of all, they attack what they see as the empire's fiscal weakness. They send visitadores, royal inspectors, to audit the books and report back. They tighten tax collection, eliminate exemptions, and create or expand monopolies on key goods: tobacco, brandy, gunpowder, playing cards, salt. They raise and broaden the alcabala, the sales tax that touches almost every transaction. From Madrid's perspective, this is state building. It's what today's technocrats would call increasing state capacity. More officials, more paperwork, more standardized rules, more revenue. And in narrow fiscal terms, it works. Revenues from the Americas rise sharply. More of the wealth extracted from mines, plantations, and trade flows into the royal coffers instead of disappearing into the pockets of local intermediaries and foreign merchants. But you don't build a fiscal state in a vacuum. You build it on people. If you were a Creole elite in Mexico, Lima, or Caracas, the reforms felt like a demotion. For generations, important offices in the colonies had gone to local families of Spanish descent born in the Americas. You collected taxes, commanded militias, managed trade, and in return you took your slice. Under the Bourbons, those offices start going to Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe. They arrive with royal backing, often with little knowledge of local society, and with clear orders to curb abuses and raise revenue. You're still paying taxes, but your influence is shrinking. You start to feel not like a partner in empire, but like a subordinate. If you were a merchant, smuggler, or hacienda owner, you now had to deal with more inspections, more licenses, a more intrusive bureaucracy. Some of your old side deals become defined as crimes. Your freedom to maneuver shrinks. And if you were at the bottom of the hierarchy, an indigenous villager, a small farmer, a mixed-race artisan, you weren't reading royal decrees, but you could feel their weight. Tobacco, which you grew or consumed, becomes a royal monopoly. You can only sell to state agents at fixed prices, and you have to buy finished products from them at prices they set. Aguardiente, the spirits many people drink, is monopolized and taxed. Cloth and other everyday goods carry higher sales taxes. Tribute obligations are enforced more strictly. Labor drafts for mines and public works are pushed harder to meet quotas. The empire calls this rationalization. You might call it suffocation. History tends to remember laws and decrees in the abstract. But what does a tax increase look like when it lands? Imagine a small town in New Granada in 1781. You're a shopkeeper or a small grower. You sell tobacco, cloth, liquor, basic goods. One day, officials post a new edict in the plaza. It lists increased taxes on everything you handle, higher alcabalas on each sale, stricter enforcement of the tobacco monopoly, new fees on stamped paper and legal documents. Your costs rise. Your customers grumble. You know that if you try to ignore the new rules, inspectors will come. A woman named Manuela Beltran walks up to that edict, reads it, and tears it down in front of everyone. That small act of defiance in the town of El Socorro becomes the spark for the revolt of the comuneros. Within days, thousands of people from nearby villages and towns are marching under a shared banner. The communities defending their rights. Their demands are concrete and brutally clear. Abolish the new taxes, end the monopolies, remove abusive officials. These are not Enlightenment theorists debating abstract rights. They are farmers, artisans, local notables staring at a tax burden that has crossed a line. They march toward Bogota. Officials panic. Negotiations begin. Royal representatives, terrified of a full-scale uprising, sign agreements promising to roll back taxes and listen to grievances. Then, once the crowds disperse, Madrid quietly repudiates the concessions. Leaders are arrested and punished. The numbers on the royal ledger, once again, take priority over the promises made in the heat of crisis. Further south, in the Andean highlands of Peru, the story sounds different on the surface and eerily similar underneath. There, Bourbon centralization intensifies an older system of extraction. The mita, the forced labor draft that pushes indigenous men into the silver mines and obrajes, the workshops that supply colonial economies. Royal officials, corregidors, have long abused their positions, forcing communities to buy overpriced goods through the repartimiento system while squeezing them for tribute and labor. Under the Bourbons, taxation increases, tribute is enforced more rigorously, and the pressure on labor deepens. The goal is the same: more silver, more revenue, more control. An indigenous noble named Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui, claiming descent from the Inca and taking the name Tupac Amaru II, initially tries to work within the system. He petitions the authorities, denounces corrupt officials, asks for relief for his people. He receives almost nothing, so he switches tactics. He seizes a particularly hated corregidor, publicly executes him, and calls on indigenous communities and others to rise up. Now, what begins as protest against specific abuses and taxes escalates into a massive rebellion stretching across the southern Andes. Tens of thousands join. Estates are attacked, roads are blocked, royal authority is challenged. The Spanish state responds with overwhelming force. The rebellion is eventually crushed. Tupac Amaru II is captured and executed with terrifying brutality. His family and followers punished in ways meant to scar memory itself. On the balance sheet in Madrid, the reforms Zayat have delivered: more revenue, tighter control, a stronger army and navy, fortifications repaired, fleets rebuilt. But those same reforms have also produced revolts in Quito in 1765 over liquor taxes, in New Granada in 1781 over sales taxes and monopolies, in Oruro and the Andean highlands over tribute and labor abuses. The empire's fiscal modernization is accompanied by a map of periodic explosions. This is the paradox of the Bourbon Project. As a financial machine, it works. As a political bargain, it fails. At the center of that failure is a simple tension. The more efficiently you extract, the more you need legitimacy to justify it. The Bourbons increase extraction dramatically, but fail to expand representation. They extend the reach of the crown into every corner of colonial life, but do not extend the voice of colonial subjects into the decisions being made. Creole elites feel displaced. Indigenous communities feel squeezed. Mestizo and mixed populations feel used as a tax base and a labor pool without rights to match. Everyone watches peninsular officials arrive, backed by the king, speaking of reform while living off the system they enforce. Over time, that experience changes how people think about themselves. Creoles begin to talk about Americans versus Spaniards, about their land as something distinct from the peninsula. They read Enlightenment texts, yes, but they also remember each time they were sidelined in appointments, each time petitions were ignored, each time a revolt was met, not with negotiation, but with punishment. Commoners don't become ideological nationalists overnight, but they remember the tobacco monopoly that ruined their small side income, the liquor tax that made their celebrations more expensive, the inspector who threatened them with jail, the distant king whose name appears on every decree but never on any remedy. By the time you reach the early 1800s, the ledger is full of more than numbers. It's full of grievances. When Napoleon invades Spain and the monarchy is thrown into crisis, Creole leaders across the Americas seize the opening. They form juntas, claim to rule in the name of the absent king at first, and then increasingly move toward independence. When they denounce peninsular tyranny and exploitation, they are drawing on decades of lived fiscal and administrative experience under the Bourbon reforms. Taxing toward revolution, it doesn't mean that a single law causes. It is a single uprising that leads straight to independence. History isn't that clean. It means something more structural, that a state's attempt to rescue itself financially can corrode the very loyalty it depends on if it treats its subjects as sources of revenue rather than partners in a political project. It's tempting to see this as a story trapped in the parchment of the 18th century. Old kings, powdered wigs, handwritten decrees. But the basic pattern is not ancient history. It's a recurring feature of the modern world. A government faces a fiscal crunch. Maybe it has fought too many wars, run too many deficits, or promised more than it can pay. Creditors circle. Ratings agencies mutter. International institutions arrive with advice. Technocrats propose a package. Broaden the tax base, cut exemptions, raise indirect taxes like value-added tax or fuel duties, privatize state monopolies, tighten enforcement. On their spreadsheets, the numbers add up. Debt to GDP stabilizes. Primary surplus turns positive. The bond markets are reassured. On the ground, the story is different. People who already feel excluded from political power now feel they are being asked to pay for a crisis they did not create. Prices rise, wages don't. Public services shrink or start charging more. Everyday essentials suddenly cost more for the sake of reform. In some places, these measures are accepted as the price of stability. In others, they trigger protests, strikes, riots. The pattern is familiar. Governments speak the language of necessity, reform, discipline. Citizens speak the language of fairness, voice, and dignity. There is no one-to-one line from the Bourbon reforms to any modern austerity program. But there is a shared underlying logic, treating society as a balance sheet to be optimized rather than a political community to be bargained with. The Spanish Bourbons believed they were making their empire more modern and more secure. They were for a time. They raised more money, built more ships, and fought more wars. But each rational measure carried a political cost. Each new tax, each monopoly, each centralizing move chipped away at the consent that had kept the empire together through its more chaotic Habsburg days. That is the lesson buried under the paperwork. You can balance the books and unbalance the regime. You can strengthen the state's hand in the short term and weaken its foundations in the long term. You can tax toward order, or you can tax toward revolution. The difference lies in who designs the system, who benefits from it, who pays for it, and who gets a say. The Bourbon reforms should make us wary whenever we hear certain phrases repeated with confidence. Necessary fiscal adjustment, modernizing the tax code, broadening the base, removing distortions. Not because reform is always bad, but because those phrases often hide the most important question of all. Necessary for whom? Modernizing for whose benefit? Broadening which base? And leaving which concentrations of wealth untouched? Every empire, every state, every government that hits a fiscal wall faces the same temptation the Bourbons did. To lean on those who are easiest to tax and easiest to ignore, while protecting those who are powerful enough to matter. For a while, the numbers improve. Then one day, someone like Manuela Beltran tears down a decree, or someone like Tupac Amaru stops asking politely, and the illusion of consent evaporates. The Bourbon kings thought they were saving their empire through reform. In reality, they were teaching millions of people what it feels like to be treated as a revenue stream rather than as citizens. When the time came, that memory was worth more than any royal promise. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.